You're walking down the sidewalk late at night, and a cop car pulls up next to you. The officer gets out, starts asking where you're going, and your pulse starts hammering. If you've watched any police encounter videos online, you probably think the ultimate shield is locking eyes with the officer and dropping that famous question, "Am I being detained?" A lot of folks think this phrase is a magic spell. They think saying it forces the cop to back off, or it protects their rights if things go south later. Most people are completely wrong about how this actually works. Asking if you're detained doesn't automatically shut down a conversation, and it doesn't force the officer to walk away. But it still does something incredibly powerful, just not in the way you probably expect. Let's clear up exactly why people think this phrase is a superpower. It all comes down to the legal line between a casual chat and an arrest. In the law, we call this a consensual encounter. A consensual encounter is just a regular conversation where you're completely free to leave at any time. Cops are allowed to walk up to anybody on a public street and start talking. They can ask your name, ask where you're headed, and ask what you're up to. They don't need a single shred of evidence to do it. But because it's a consensual encounter, you don't have to answer. You can politely say you don't want to talk, turn around, and walk away. As long as the officer lets you leave, it's just two people chatting on the sidewalk. The problem is that normal people get incredibly nervous around cops. When an officer steps into your path, it feels like you're trapped. It feels like you're already in trouble. You assume you've to stand there and answer every single question. Because of that fear, people go online looking for a shield. They find a YouTube video that tells them to ask the magic question. The internet advice says if you ask the question, the cop has to answer you. Then you just walk away. It's completely backwards. When you ask the officer if you're being detained, you're actually engaging them in conversation. You're participating in the encounter. You're waiting for their permission to leave. You're treating them like the boss of the situation. Here's how the interaction actually plays out when people try to use the internet script. The cop usually says, "No, you're not being detained." Then the officer immediately follows up with another question. They ask where you're coming from, or they ask to see your identification. Now you're back in the hot seat. You're still standing there. The encounter didn't break. You just paused it for a second. Even worse, if you say the phrase with an attitude, things can go downhill fast. If you start yelling about your rights and refusing to cooperate, the officer might start viewing you as a threat. Cops don't like feeling challenged any more than anybody else does. And when a cop feels challenged, they start looking for a reason to escalate the situation. They start looking for a reason to change that casual chat into something much more serious. You need to know about the next level of police encounters. It's called an investigative detention. An investigative detention is when an officer temporarily holds you because they have reasonable suspicion. Reasonable suspicion is a legal term, meaning the officer has specific facts suggesting you might be involved in a crime. This is usually called a Terry stop, named after a famous court case. During a Terry stop, you're absolutely not free to leave. You're being detained. The officer can force you to stand there, and they can pat you down for weapons. They can do this without arresting you. When a cop has reasonable suspicion, asking if you're detained won't break their grip. The officer will just say yes, and then they'll tell you to put your hands on the wall. This is exactly why laws vary by state. Some states require you to give your name to an officer during an investigative detention. These are called stop and identify statutes. Other states don't have these laws. But if you're standing in a state that requires you to identify yourself during a detention, refusing to give your name gives the officer a brand new reason to arrest you. Now you've turned a temporary hold into an actual criminal charge. Let's look at a concrete scenario. Imagine you're walking home from the bus stop after a late shift. A police car rolls up. The officer gets out and says there was a report of someone breaking into cars nearby. The officer steps into your path. Your adrenaline spikes. You remember the internet advice, and you ask, "Am I being detained?" You just handed them reasonable suspicion on a silver platter. Let's do another concrete scenario. You're pumping gas late at night. A cop car pulls up to the pump next to you. The officer gets out and starts asking about a fight that supposedly happened at the bar down the street. This is a consensual encounter. You haven't done anything wrong, but you don't want to stand around in the cold answering questions. If you follow the bad internet advice, you might puff out your chest, refuse to make eye contact, and yell the magic phrase. Now the officer thinks you're hiding something or looking for a fight. They're going to push harder. If you follow the actual legal play, you stay calm. You look at the officer politely. You ask, "Officer, am I being detained?" The officer says, "No, I'm just asking if you saw anything." You smile and say, "I didn't see anything. Have a safe night." You put the gas pump back, get in your car, and drive away. The encounter is over. You won. You didn't need to yell. You just needed to ask the question to confirm the legal boundary and then act on it. The key is understanding the difference between words and actions. People want a magic phrase because they want the words to do the heavy lifting. They don't want to actually walk away. They want the cop to retreat. But the law doesn't care about your words nearly as much as it cares about your actions. The law asks an objective question. Would a reasonable person in your shoes feel free to leave? The courts look at the physical reality of the situation. Did the officer block your path? Did the officer use a commanding tone? Did the officer put their hand on their weapon? Did the officer turn on their flashing lights? All these factors matter way more than whether you recited a magic phrase. Remember that this stuff varies heavily by state. Every state has its own rules on when police can demand identification. Every state has its own rules on what counts as reasonable suspicion. The core constitutional rules are the same everywhere, but the details change at the state line. You need to know the actual playbook where you live. You also need to know when to stop talking entirely. If the officer says yes, you're detained, the conversation is over. Don't argue the facts. Don't try to prove your innocence on the side of the road. Cops don't decide guilt, they just collect evidence. Anything you say to prove you're innocent can and will be used to build a case against you. Stop talking. Ask for a lawyer. Let the system work itself out later. You're not going to win a constitutional debate with a cop at 2 a.m. on the side of the road. You're only going to give them more ammunition. Let's bring it all together. The phrase isn't a magic spell that forces cops to run away. It's a legal probe. It forces the officer to declare the encounter a consensual chat or an investigative detention. That declaration is the real power. Once you know what kind of encounter you're in, you know exactly what to do. If it's consensual, exercise your right to leave. If it's a detention, exercise your right to remain silent. In both cases, the goal isn't to win an argument with the officer. The goal is to protect your legal rights for the courtroom down the road. You need to be the calmest person on the sidewalk. You need to let the officer make the mistakes. That's how you actually win the legal game. This is education, not legal advice for your specific situation. Laws change. They vary by state. And if you're facing criminal charges, you need a local attorney who knows the judges and the cops in your county. Have you ever been in a situation where you weren't sure if you were allowed to walk away from a cop? Tell me exactly what happened down in the comments. If this breakdown gave you the actual playbook for handling a street encounter, send it to a buddy who needs to know how to protect themselves on a Friday night. Make sure you subscribe to Scribble Law so you always know the real rules before someone tries to use the system against you.